Welcome everybody here, and good afternoon to the first in my series or the Rogers Chair lecture series on the theme Communicating Solidarity. My name, for those of you, most of the people in the room, I haven't met many people, including new faculty members. I haven't been around the faculty in recent years for other reasons. But my name is James Compton. I'm the current holder of the Rogers Chair of Studies in Journalism and New Information Technology. I'm also an associate professor here in the Faculty of Information and Media Studies. And so before I have the pleasure of introducing today's speaker, Dr. Anton Allahar, I'd like to acknowledge that the University of Western Ontario is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabeg, Haudenosaunee, Lunawepaq, Attawattawan peoples, and these, of course, are the lands connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. And with this, we respect the long-standing relationships that Indigenous nations have to this land, as of course they are the original caretakers. And we acknowledge the historical and ongoing social, political, cultural, racial, and environmental injustices that Indigenous peoples endure in Canada. Now to our featured speaker. My friend, Professor Anton Allahar, holds a PhD in political and economic sociology from the University of Toronto, and he's a full professor of sociology emeritus here at Western. His principal areas of interest are ethnic and racial relations, education, globalization, nationalism, and democracy. He's the author of 8 books, has edited 4 others, has published over 100 refereed journal articles and book chapters, and many other things. And those of you who have had the pleasure to attend one of his lectures, and I know some of you are in the room, know that he's a lively and engaging speaker, and this skill has garnered him 7 major awards for excellence in university teaching, including the prestigious Canadian National 3M Award. And all these achievements make Professor Allahar a perfect choice to kick off the series for us. Now, the overall theme that I chose for the series is communicating solidarity in an unstable world. So this is a common observation that public life today in liberal democracies has become hyper-polarized in recent years, with opinion research indicating that faith in mainstream liberal institutions, including government and journalism, has faltered, and there are many bad faith actors out there, politicians, conspiracy theorists, labeling news organizations as fake news. None of this should be a surprise to anyone in the room. And in conversations that Dr. Allahar and I had leading up to this, when I asked him if he'd be interested in talking about this, we agreed that approaching the question of social solidarity in the current conjuncture requires going beyond the clickbait headlines we associate with Trumpism. And indeed, what is required is an historically informed sociological analysis. And this is precisely why I asked Professor Allahar to speak with us today. His 1998 book, Richer and Poorer, The Structure of Inequality in Canada, which he co-authored with James Cote, speaks directly to the need to approach questions of class, race, and gender inequality through a materialist sociological lens. And the provocative title he's given for the address today is Lies, Damn Lies, and Democracy. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the floor over to my colleague, fellow traveler, and friend, Anton. Thanks very much.
Thank you all very much. It is indeed a pleasure, and I do hope that after I have to say what I have to say, you will be equally enthusiastic in your applause. As explained in the flyer announcing today's talk, my title modifies the Disraeli quote and asks us critically to unpack the concept and the practice of democracy as a widely accepted big lie, a big deception. At the outset, I offer two cautions to you. First, I'm aware of the fact that the surest way to make enemies is to discuss others, S', politics and religion, yet I will be doing that today, to make enemies. I don't have many friends for obvious reasons, and those that I do have are dying off, and they're not being replaced. Bob. Second, having said this, it is not my intention to offend anyone, and I mean that. But this is a university classroom, and controversial ideas are meant to find refuge in university classrooms. Finally, while my empirical focus centers on the United States, much of what I have to say can apply equally to Canada, where our public mindsets are also habituated to institutionalize lying and the unquestioning or willing acceptance of myth. So here goes. A little anecdote by way of introduction, and my buddy Sal will recognize it. On a recent trip to Mexico, Sal was with me. I saw a sign in the window of a small store in a flea market that read, "Compre aquí, te robamos menos." Shop here, we will rob you less. The sign caught my attention more for its boldness than for its content, which declared honestly that the shopper will be cheated, but compared to the competition, she or he would be cheated less. I immediately thought of the parallel with liberal democratic processes, although those in charge are not as honest as the Mexican shopkeeper. Indeed, what politicians should really be saying is, we will all lie to you, but if you vote for me, I will lie to you less. For in liberal democratic democracies, liberal democratic societies, candidates for office all exaggerate the truth or lie outright by making claims that are unfounded and promises they have absolutely no intention of keeping. Yet, there are few consequences, since the lies told by candidates are normalized by the media, you guys, normalized by the media personnel simply as, quote, political spin and campaign rhetoric, which is seen as the normal or accepted antecedent of governing rhetoric. So you can lie like hell to get elected. That's just campaign rhetoric. And when you are governing, when elected, you're supposedly telling the truth. Not so. So, although Donald Trump told more than 35,000 lies while in office, he nevertheless received over 74 million votes in his subsequent bid for re-election. His lies were business as usual for a nonplussed public. Similarly, throughout history, elite control of the masses has been secured via well-crafted lies grafted onto or into public speeches that are replete with nostalgic and patriotic tales of a lost golden age, complete with promises to recapture that lost age. Therefore, when Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump promised to make America great again, both presidents played on the public nostalgic dream of recapturing an imagined past glory when Indians were savages, blacks were enslaved, women knew their places, and brave white settlers tamed a wild frontier. Those are romanticized as the glory days of democracy that seek to paint the past in heroic strokes of the brush while distracting from an accurate understanding of the atrocities committed in the name of freedom and democracy. For the moment, and to frame my remarks regarding lies and truth, I quote from Hitler's Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, who said, quote, "If you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people eventually will come to believe it," unquote. Now, some of you will recall the public boast made by Trump, quote, "If you say it long enough, hard enough, and often enough, people will start to believe it," unquote. Guess whose playbook Trump was using? The Minister of Propaganda for Hitler. These quotations speak to the Canadian and American mindsets that are heavily influenced by myths and lies, and that have been repeated for so long, so hard, and so often that they are accepted today as obvious truths. Some of these obvious truths: Canada and America are democracies. The founding fathers were brave men who tamed a wild frontier. Capitalism is freedom. Ours a free and equal society. No one is above the law. There is one system of justice, and that justice is blind. Poverty and homelessness are caused by individual laziness. These are just some of the lies to which we are habituated, and we don't really, I was told yesterday that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. Really? To unpack lies that inform so much of our daily exchanges, I want also to untangle the phenomenon of Trumpism, as James said, and the reasons why it resonates with tens of millions of Americans and very many Canadians. To do so, I will later invoke George Orwell's concept of doublethink and W.E.B. Du Bois' concept of double consciousness. Just bear with me, I'll get there presently. This said, we must not confuse democracy with liberal democracy. For while democracy is meant to be about the rule of law, liberal democracy is better understood as the rule of laws made by capitalists to benefit capital. They're not the same things. This suggests the question of class inequality and brings to mind the 2008 crisis of capitalism that was reported in the media as, quote, a national crisis, which just showed how the nation's interests were defined by the interests of the dominant class or classes. Stated differently, the economic interests of capital were synonymous with capitalist democracy, and fearing that the system was about to implode, politicians, economic pundits, and ordinary citizens all agreed that, like General Motors, these huge corporations were too big to fail. Too big to fail. For once, they were not lying. They were too big to fail. They were not lying. And in a public lecture I did in 2008 during the matter, I labeled this process as one of, quote, bailouts, buyouts, sellouts, and cop-outs, unquote. Laissez-faire competitive capitalism had clearly given way to corporate capitalism and its offshoot, crony capitalism, which are also legal under the rules and the laws of capitalist democracy. In a true or ideal democracy, on the other hand, leaders would be accountable to voters, and if the former should resist accountability, then the latter shall have the right of immediate recall. You can't lie your way into office and once having been elected, start doing the opposite. The right of immediate recall means that you will have some responsibility. This underlines three essential features that best describe a proper democracy, and I'll get back to this in my conclusion. One, transparency in decision making. I was once the president of the Caribbean Studies Association, and I inherited an empty treasury, coffers, And I thought that the only way that I will not have hands and fingers pointed accusingly at me and so on is every decision I make about travel, about this, that, and the other that involve money, I will do publicly, transparently, so no one can say afterwards. Secondly, along with transparency, a politically educated or informed citizenry. It is a sine qua non, see I talk Latin too, of democracy, a politically educated or informed citizenry. And three, we need a responsible mass media that are free. Media are, in Canada, media is a singular noun. The media are free to combat lies and fake news. If the media are not doing that, then those media are not free, they're not doing their job. I will address education and mass media shortly, but in the meantime, ask yourselves whether these features are present in our democracies here in Canada and in the US. To unpack the proper understanding of democracy, and building on an earlier discussion with Professor Compton, I will introduce the concept of ideology and use the ideology of solidarity as my point of departure. In the interest of clarity, let's discuss some of the synonyms and antonyms of solidarity. For example, the concepts of unity and togetherness capture the essence of solidarity, while its opposite may be conceived in terms of division and conflict. I'm reminded here of a statement made by Fidel Castro to the Cuban people some years ago when Fidel said, "Podemos ser unidos sin ser unánimes." We can be united without having to be unanimous in our opinions and points of view. Given our Trump-induced divisive times, Castro's statement speaks to the idea of compromise. In other words, because we are not all individually and culturally identical, the avoidance of conflict makes it worthwhile to explore the spaces of common ground that lie between solidarity and division. Thus, the ideology of solidarity, for example, cooperative communalism and sharing, may be pitted against the ideologies of competitive individualism and narcissism that characterize capitalism. Nowhere is the latter more clear than in the recent responses to the COVID epidemic and the anti-vaxxer movement in Canada, where the truckers claimed to be exercising their individual freedom not to be vaccinated. Not only are they free, but they're individually free. The ideology of individualism and the ideology of liberalism. This is where the French get liberté and the Spanish get libertad, and we have the Statue of Liberty. I was once in New York and looked up in the phone book the word liberty, and so I found there was the Liberty statue, Liberty shoe shine, Liberty pizza, Liberty haircuts, any damn thing you want to be. Remember, you say it often enough and long enough, they will believe it. They will believe they're libertad, they're free. These people felt they were individually free to resist the government's mandate of vaccination. The ideologies of individualism and liberalism are baked into the ideology of capitalist democracy. And the truckers, did I say that right? Adamantly asserted their individual rights to freedom while taking no account of how the exercise of those individual rights jeopardized communal freedom and safety of others. This said, solidarity is not an absolute. It must be qualified. For example, there's national solidarity or unity, there's racial solidarity or unity, and there's cultural solidarity or unity. This is where the cases of Trumpism and white nationalism become relevant. White nationalists are white supremacists who are opposed to certain immigrants and immigration policies as they apply to people of other ethno-national origins. For white nationalists, a solidary and united Canadian or American nation is one that is culturally white and which ideologically implies being Christian, English-speaking, of European origin, even being pro-free market capitalism and pro-capitalist democracy. As systems of ideas and beliefs, ideologies will contain lies and distortions of facts. Thus, the ideology of freedom is part of our cultural mindset, just as the truckers said, I am free to not be vaccinated. Part of our cultural mindset, which leads us to believe we are free. We live in a free society. While the other, those who are not free, are the ones who live in the communist countries. They are controlled and they are unfree. Thus, in the much celebrated book by Daniel Bell, titled The End of Ideology, Bell applauds the demise of communism and socialism in the Soviet Union and gleefully anticipates the freeing of long-suffering people from communist tyranny. Bell, however, was unaware of his own Western anti-communist ideological biases, which saw the fall of the Soviet Union as ushering in a new era of truth and freedom as defined by capitalism, democracy, and free markets. Those same biases inform a simplistic ideological view of the world as comprising three types of countries: the capitalist countries, the communist countries, and the third world countries. This is ideologically misleading, for well over 90% of the poor, underdeveloped third world countries are capitalists. They're not just third world. How did they become poor? Because the people are stupid? Well, some of the racial theories will give us that, but it is because of the relations of exploitation of underdevelopment. Haiti, El Salvador, Guatemala, Liberia, South Sudan, for example, are capitalist democracies. Para que sepan ustedes, just saying. This introduces me to one of the central myths that informs our public mindset. Remember, however, as I said earlier, Dean Lisa, my aim is not to offend anyone, but to point out that when dealing with a credulous population, a population open to believing, a credulous population, where belief trumps knowledge, it is not difficult to get those people to accept as fact certain things as true that cannot withstand scientific inquiry. Remember, too, that white Christian evangelicals are Trump's major support base. In the US, and irrespective of educational achievement, political affiliation, social class, race, ethnicity, gender, or sexual orientation, Christianity is embraced by 63 to 65% of the population in the US. Such credulity can cross occupational lines and extend even to presidents, prime ministers, priests, and professors. Little alliteration there, James. Thus, we have fought wars over religious beliefs, over whose God is the right one and whose God is the wrong one. Therefore, widespread acceptance of myth, the story that a virgin got pregnant, of Jesus' crucifixion, of his resurrection from the dead, his subsequent ascension into heaven, his second coming, the rapture, etc., all feed that public mindset. President Biden goes to church every Sunday, and he does the stuff. And I look at him and I say to myself, that man is crazy. He believes this stuff. When a population can be made uncritically to accept such stories as true, believers become ideal targets for ordained ministers, slick-talking snake oil salesmen, professional preachers, charismatic messengers of God, and TV evangelists, as well as crooked politicians. Sensing their vulnerabilities, such religious and political entrepreneurs make them wild promises about freedom, death, and rebirth into the kingdom of the Lord, seated at the right-hand side of God. Thus, because a democratic country is understood as one that celebrates the freedom of religious worship, Western democracies are synonymous with the embrace of Christianity that, as pointed out above, is itself based on wild myths and beliefs. Among those wild myths and beliefs, Water can magically be turned into wine. Sal is an Italian, he likes wine. Water cannot be turned into rum. The multitude, according to the Bible stories, the multitude, which in those days represented 5,000 people, can be fed with just 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. They would lick inflation with that. Feed 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And this is another one, again, no offense. Eating a man's flesh and drinking his blood are not cannibalistic acts. We do that. Those who are worshipers, those who go on Sunday like Biden, does not cause them any dis-ease. Spelled like disease, but it has a hyphen. Once more, I say this not to outrage anyone, but to show how credulity can be baked into a mindset and believers can be unaware of the distinction between what they believe and what they know. They will tell you, I know God exists. No, what you really mean is you believe, because there's no empirical proof of that. Further, when the disposition to act on belief as opposed to knowledge is activated, the result can be explosive. This is what informed the actions of the Canadian truckers and anti-vaxxers, the QAnon conspiracy theorists, and American insurrectionaries at the Capitol who believed the big lie. The big lie is separate from all these other little lies that litter our understandings. Think, too, of how this mindset influenced, this one, Bob, you would like, the Catholic history of the Holy Crusades. Holy Crusades, can you imagine? It's an oxymoron. Between the years 1096 and 1300, and the Spanish Inquisition from 1478 to 1834, where hundreds of thousands, if not millions, were murdered because they believed in a God different from the one that the Crusaders and the Inquisitors believed in. This kind of credulity, this kind of acceptance of myth, unquestioningly has led to what I call the death of expertise, where we find people with primary or high school education who defy a world-renowned scholar and scientist like Dr. Anthony Fauci and claim that they know more about virology, science, and medicine than he does. The death of expertise, thanks to the internet too. So how do we secure solidarity in a world where the acceptance of myth and non-scientific beliefs are normalized, where half the population believes that women are not as smart as men, that blacks are not fully human, that the poor and the homeless are lazy, that gays are pedophiles, that Mexicans are rapists, and that Muslims are born terrorists? How do we? Just this morning, we heard here in London Aunt, in an apartment building, the folks woke up to all of the graffiti about we need to commit genocide against the Muslims. Right here in London Aunt, we have that sort of thing. And remember, the folks who hold these beliefs walk among us. Disturbingly, they reproduce too. They are political leaders, preachers, teachers, police officers, taxi drivers, plumbers, and Walmart greeters. So it crosses all groups. By confusing belief and truth, in America, the so-called world's leading democracy, champions of free speech are today burning and banning books, free speech, burn the books, ban the books, seeking to erase history, firing teachers, denying women's rights to control their own bodies, and suppressing the black vote via gerrymandering and redistricting and so on. And this does not give them any pause when they want to say that we are the freest country in the world. Last night on the Joy Reid show, former Speaker Nancy Pelosi said that the attack on the Capitol was an attack on the world's temple of democracy. So you know I had to flag that because I'm talking to you today. Not just the temple, but the whole world's temple of democracy is in that very building today where they're about to elect Jim Jordan to run the show and become third in line for the presidency. All of this goes on while the same champions who are burning and banning and so on and so on, are also champions of the Second Amendment, and their followers are shooting up schools, churches, synagogues, cinemas, and shopping malls, routinely attacking and killing gays, transgender, and homeless people. The healthiest democracy in the world. How different are we in Canada? What is our record on missing and murdered Indigenous women? What about the residential schools? And for example, how about our government's ongoing granting of, quote, most favored nation trading status to oppressive governments in countries like Saudi Arabia and India? President Biden is in Israel, 2 aircraft carriers, giving guns and bombs and planes and so on and so forth to Netanyahu, whose fascistic policies make him a brother of Narendra Modi and some of these other folks. This is being done by the biggest democracy in the world to help the only democracy in the Middle East. Figure it out. Because facts don't matter, the fiction of ours as a free, equal, and democratic country persists. My mother used to say to me and my 2 brothers, "You will be judged by the friends you keep." We keep friends with the Saudis. In India, on a routine basis, young women standing at a bus stop can be raped in broad daylight. Good friends, we'll do that. Let's celebrate Modi and the Hindutva ideology. The foregoing shines light on the role of the corporate media, the so-called free press, that perpetuates the myth of democracy. Consider, for example, how news anchors and reporters choose to frame stories or spin stories in ways that create the illusion of a free debate, as, for example, in, did we go too far in Iraq or not far enough? The fact of the matter is those are not 2 sides of a debate, but rather one side. Had it been properly framed, the debate question would have been, should we have gone to Iraq or not? That's a 2-sided debate. The other way, did we go too far or not far in? Come on, give me a break, man. By the normalization of political lies, it's not really alarming for fake news when promoted by the conservative or the liberal media, and I don't know the difference between them if only looking at the coverage of Hamas and Israel today. Whether promoted by the conservative or liberal media is being received by a public that is habituated to confusion, to lies. In our age of celebrity culture, as many journalists have become celebrities, Walter Cronkite, Barbara Walters, Bob Woodward, Diane Sawyer, Carl Bernstein, Katie Couric, etc., a distracted public feels no unease. Yet we hear that a free press is the guardian of democracy and should always be protected. But the free press is not really free, since the media are privately owned, and in capitalism, the tiny core of private owners and stockholders can decide what is newsworthy. Rupert Murdoch's recent travails should suffice. Upon closer examination, the so-called ideological differences between right-wing and left-wing media are a sham. For example, how does Fox News coverage of the recent Israeli-Hamas war differ from coverage on CBC, MSNBC, CNN, and the others? What really? Everybody is rushing to stand in line to say, we stand with an ironclad hug for our comrades in Israel. All of them. No one dares to have a dissenting point of view for fear of being fired or beaten up or taken out. As long as the principal defenders of the status quo refuse to recognize the source of the problem lies within the prevailing ideology of liberal democracy and its fiction of a free press, there will be no solution. It is like the well-worn plot of the horror movie, quote, we have traced the call and it's coming from inside the house. That's scary, right? with the lighting just right and the music. We've traced the call, and it's coming from inside. They're in the basement, in the attic. Chris Hedges is just correct when chiding the media for their complicity in political deception. Quote, this is Hedges, "The ability to magnify these simple and childish lies, to repeat them and have surrogates repeat them in endless loops of news cycles, gives these lies the aura of an uncontested truth. It feels good not to think. All we have to do is visualize what we want, believe in ourselves, and summon those hidden inner resources, whether divine or national, and make the world conform to our desires. Reality is never an impediment to our advancement." Chris Hedges. This leads to my claim that in both Canadian and American democracy, we're dealing with a one-party system in this democracy, and that the media are loath to recognize this one party. They still refer to ours as a multi-party democracy. For me, the one party is the party of capital that may have different branches. It's one party with different branches, NDP, Conservative, Democrat, Republican. But at base, all are single-mindedly committed to promoting and defending the interests of capital, that one party. Noam Chomsky states, quote, "The media are a corporate monopoly. They have the same point of view. The two parties are two fractions of the business party. Most of the population doesn't even bother voting because it looks meaningless. They are marginalized and properly distracted. At least that's the goal," unquote. This is Chomsky. To this end, we must acknowledge that the state in democratic capitalist society has as its prime responsibility the protection and preservation of the conditions under which capital is produced and reproduced. That's the fundamental purpose of the state in capitalist society. Secondly, it's to protect the interests of the capitalists, and third, of workers, because without workers, you have no capitalism. To admit this claim is to admit that capitalist equality is an oxymoron, for by definition, the system is based upon the unequal ownership of property based on exploitation of those who don't own. Ideologically then, we may understand the widely accepted functionalist argument in sociology that socio-economic inequality is a good thing. Social and economic inequality is a good thing because it motivates those who are lower on the wealth and status hierarchies to work harder. You can look up and see all these people have their dazzling lives, and that motivates you to work harder. This is where the conservative functionalist theorists are very much prepared to say social inequality is a good thing. At the same time, political inequality, defined as one person, one vote, is a passion, because it means you could be the richest person in the world, I could be the poorest person, we are equal because we all have one vote. That's part of the fiction, that one vote equalizes us. This defines the orthodox thinking about inequality in bourgeois society today. How many of us blame homelessness on laziness, on bad luck? Add to this the ideological belief that economic competition is free and fair. It occurs among equals and takes place on a level playing field. If you believe that, I have a bridge in Brooklyn I could sell you. It is also ideological to presume that the competition separates what is called, or who are called, the natural losers from the natural winners. There's nothing natural about winning and losing in this context. In this ideological mindset, poverty, and I always love this one, when we would go down to Cuba and so on, and Jeff and I have been there together a number of times, the Canadian tourists, as soon as you get on a plane heading anywhere like that, they become instant sociologists. They have a critical gaze that they don't have back home. And they suddenly see poverty and prostitution over there, but they don't see it here. And when they see poverty or prostitution there, they say that whole damn socialist system is screwed. But when they see it here, they say, oh, that's a lazy woman. That's why she's out in the street doing that, or lazy man, why he's out in the street doing that. That's the ideological thing, where we condemn an entire socioeconomic system for poverty, and here we condemn an individual for it. Leave that system intact, please. I want to, and we blame the individuals again for alcoholism, for gambling addiction, and so on, while these things are pushed by the big manufacturers of the alcohol and the... I want to switch to this thing called Trumpism, which is not simply about Donald Trump. For Trumpism is a modern name for the unique American mindset that is steeped in various myths and beliefs about America as a land of the free and the home of the brave, where the American dream can be realized by everyone. Capitalism has its winners and has its losers. And Trump was able to secure the support of the latter, the losers, by playing to their fears and claiming that they were being left behind, his words, in the new America. The blame was placed firmly on immigrants or foreigners who were imagined as displacing and replacing the traditional Americans, well, not traditional, those are the First Nations, but the European descended Americans, and who comprised Trump's base, the 70% white, evangelical, Christian, non-college educated voters. This morning, again here in our little London aunt, Nathaniel Veltman, who ran down and killed the 4 members of that Muslim family and so on, he said that his decision was in large part motivated by the fact that white people were being displaced and that we were committing genocide against white people in London aunt. Okay? Don't just take my word for it. It's going to be in the news at 6 o'clock today. Trumpism is premised on the manufactured fear among the population and includes conspiracy theories and the uncritical acceptance of grandiose untruths that prepare the fertile soil in which those theories take hold. Andrew Cherlin addressed, quote, the desperation of the white working class over the deteriorating industrial economy, unquote, and claiming that they were left behind in modern America encouraged their, quote, tendency to racialize that desperation and to blame outsiders, unquote. This leads to replacement theory that Veltman talked about in his court yesterday. They're replacing us. They're coming in and taking our country, taking our culture, the great replacement theory. Similarly, anybody interested in the quotes and so on, you can just contact me. I didn't bring the list of references. James Walcott describes these people, the left behind ones, as, quote, small town, heartland, blue collar, bingo hall, left behind, authentic representatives and descendants of the real America, unquote. These are Trump's people. Here, the sentiment of being left behind has a coded meaning that Trump never had to explain to his followers. Unable to understand their growing poverty and displacement as tied to the normal economic operations of capitalism, the rural, poorly educated working-class whites were cast as, quote, losers in an affluent society that was made by their forefathers for them. I'm sure some of us remember when Trump won the Nevada caucus in 2016 and said, quote, we won with the poorly educated. I love the poorly educated, unquote. The loss of the American dream has left them confused, fearful, and even violent, and Trump weaponizes that fear. For in the person of Trump, the self-anointed chosen one, when he had his hand and looked heavenward and said, I'm the chosen one, they feel their salvation is promised. This is known in their language as the Great Awakening. And regardless of his grabbing women in different parts, his marital infidelities, and multiple criminal indictments, they cling blindly to his every word. This ties back to the white supremacist Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, and the neo-Nazi chants of, quote, Jews will not replace us, unquote. In reference to them, Rachel Maddow of MSNBC commented that, quote, atomized and disconnected populations are primed for extremism. Thus, Trump's base of white Christian nationalists and the many armed right-wing militias the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, the 3%ers, the Boogaloo Boys, genuinely imagine a secret plot driven by the hordes of woke invaders. Among these hordes of woke invaders, you have non-white, non-Christian, non-English speaking others empowered by Black Lives Matter, Me Too, pro-choice, LGBTQ2, and immigration activists who are bent on displacing and replacing them, on stealing their culture, stealing their country. Governor DeSantis in Florida is the most recent of the spokespersons for this. But it is a mistake to focus, as I said, on Trump as the cause of Trumpism. For before Trump, white supremacy, Christian nationalism, the gun culture, Bible-loving bigotry and misogyny had defined the American mindset from the founding. This is where the base's low levels of education and their disposition to credulity, their eschewing of science, not to mention shallow appeals to patriotism, are seen to serve the powerful whose aim is to distract and to control them. Thus, 75 years ago, George Orwell could have been speaking of the American public today when he said of the proles in Oceania in his novel, Brainwashed, quote, "All that was required of them was a primitive patriotism which could be appealed to whenever it was necessary, a nation of warriors and fanatics, marching forward in perfect unity, all thinking the same thoughts and shouting the same slogans. USA, USA, USA." In light of the foregoing, how might the distortion of ideal democracy be tied to the phenomenon of Trumpism? The answer may be sought, as I hinted earlier, by blending the concepts of doublethink of George Orwell and double consciousness of Dubois, a Haitian sociologist. To begin, doublethink describes a state of public confusion fed by misinformation. We're in the faculty of information, right, James? Misinformation, whereby people embrace contradictory facts without seeing the contradictions. Quote, "To know and not to know, to be conscious of complete truthfulness while telling carefully constructed lies, to hold simultaneously two differing opinions." Orwell told us, night is day, war is peace, slavery is freedom. Similarly, along with that doublethink of Orwell, double consciousness describes the conflicted and contradictory condition of being black and American at the same time, living in a society that extols freedom and equality, but simultaneously practices systemic racial exclusion. For black Americans, Dubois notes, doubleness and contradiction define their daily lives as, and here's a quote, "a way of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness. An American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body." I apply these concepts of doubleness to understanding the poor white credulous, poorly educated, lonely, atomized, unemployed, and underemployed American in the land of plenty. They're the ones left behind and whose angst and loneliness Hillary Clinton described as being weaponized by Trump. Their angst is tinged by fear and confusion, and like black Americans, the numbing balm of religion is liberally applied. I was hearkening back to Trump's notion of the religion as the opiate of the masses. For in Trump's left behind followers, if the darkening, the Latinization, and Islamization of America caused their social decline, his dog whistles to white supremacist sentiments, to anti-immigration tropes, to America First policies, etc., were comforting to those who could not compete with better educated, racialized outsiders, immigrants. Thus, combined with their deep religiosity, his populist exhortations made about making America great again hit home, and the unease produced by their doubleness was given an outlet in blacks, Muslims, immigrants, LGBTQ members, etc., as scapegoats. Their doubleness impedes their ability, A, to understand that capitalism has no regard for color of labor. Capital will exploit where it can, when it can, whomever it can, however it can. White labor, slave labor, child labor, family labor, prison labor, and so on. This is what it is about. It's not concerned about skin color. These folks are not able to grasp the contradiction of Trump's claims to be the voice of the poor woman and man while giving trillion-dollar tax cuts to his billionaire friends. Again, Marx's false consciousness, Marx's and Engels, comes to mind. In sum, Trumpism is like a pre-Enlightenment mindset that privileges belief over knowledge, God over science, and suggests Isaac Asimov's insightful observation, quote, Asimov, "There is no belief, however foolish, that will not gather its faithful adherents and who will defend it to the death." Even a foolish idea will have people who support it. Steeped in doublethink and double consciousness, the bulk of the gas-lighted American population are convinced that reality is not what they see or hear. Indeed, Trump told them, quote, "Stick with us. Don't believe the crap you see from these people. Fake news. What you're seeing and what you're reading is not what is happening," unquote. Henry Giroux summarizes the entire matter when he declared that, quote, "We must reject the false notion that capitalism and democracy are synonymous." False notion, capitalism and democracy, Giroux says, cannot be synonymous. Now I come, when I was speaking with James before, he made reference to a couple of the books that I wrote on education, and I've tried to segue them into this presentation. Earlier, I noted that an educated or politically literate population is essential to a healthy democracy. So when hundreds of millions of Canadians and Americans uncritically believe that the one person, one vote mantra defines freedom and equality for all, this raises questions about our political literacy in this country. I trace the problem to two principal sources: the dumbing down of higher education and the shallowness of popular culture. The first, as universities have become transformed from educational institutions to pseudo-vocational institutions, critical education takes a back seat to job training. People ask you, where did you get your training? I love telling them I'm from Trinidad, where we train dogs and we educate people. I wasn't trained. I was educated. I am able to see laterally. Training implies the train, the locomotive that pulls the carriages. The carriages cannot help but follow. They've got to go with the locomotive. So when you're well trained, you can take orders very well. When you're educated, you can say, but what if? Yeah, those are two very important differences. In the process, students today are regarded as what the administration calls BIUs. Does anybody know what a BIU is? Oh my gosh, how the times have changed. They are basic income units. And we get, hi Lily, we get money at the university from the government depending on how many BIUs we have. And we get so many BIUs for an MA student and so many for a PhD student, undergrad. They're regarded as BIUs, and the bottom line now dictates courses and programs, while the language of capital, of commercial exchange, seeps into our daily exchanges. This is evident when students claim to be, quote, shopping for a good course. Okay? One had the audacity to say, I'm shopping for a good professor. I said, you're in the wrong office. And I will quote from a former student who wrote to me not long ago. She said, quote, "Today I registered online for the guidance additional qualification, and I was snickering to myself as I registered because I was having flashbacks of a particular lecture you once gave to our class. Well, she was enrolling online, I enrolled in the course tonight. I went through a series of steps. 1, add course to shopping cart. 2, added to order. 3, proceed to checkout. 4, time left to complete transaction. I had 10 minutes to pay. And 5, purchase complete." Now, this is the point at which the language of capital has seeped into this, and BIUs are therefore not all that foreign. And students used to say, hey, I paid for this diploma, you better give it to me. It's a cash transaction. Whether you learn or not is incidental. This modern attitude to higher education and learning sets the stage for the eclipsing of philosophically based critical education and its replacement by more efficient endeavors at training, and mutes the development of philosophical thinking that once enabled students to challenge long-standing assumptions about democracy, equality, freedom, and fairness. I was given a first-hand look at this. I used to teach the BMOS students. They had to do sociology as one of their options and so on and so forth. And that's when I first was alerted to the shift away from critical thinking to the manipulation of things. People ceased to be that literate and became very numerate. They're quantumaniacs, but they can't think their ways out of wet paper bags, as the saying goes. Today at Western, for example, along with the world-famous Ivy Business School that trains the young capitalists of tomorrow, they're now building the Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation that will house the Institute of Entrepreneurship, not to mention Huron University College's Center for Leadership, Ethics, and, yes, Entrepreneurship. These are the signs of the times. Once more, Chris Hedges says, quote, he focuses on the US, quote, there are over 42 million American adults, 20% of whom hold high school diplomas, who cannot read, as well as 50 million who read at a 4th and 5th grade level, and they have high school diplomas. Nearly a third of the nation's population is illiterate or barely literate, unquote. Chris Hedges. Combined with wokeness and political correctness, the dumbing down of the curriculum makes students ideal candidates for believing in conspiracy theories, as well as the mysteries of God and religion, alternative facts and fake news, as well as claims that capitalist democracy is a superior form of rule. Some of you may remember Winston Churchill's observation that democracy is the worst system of rule in the world, except for all the others. That's his words. In other words, it's the best. It's the worst thing, but all the others are pale by comparison. I go back to Isaac Asimov, who reflected on this matter 40 years ago and described anti-intellectualism, denial, and purposeful ignorance as American traits. Quote, there's a cult of ignorance in the United States, and there has always been. The strain of anti-intellectualism has been a constant thread winding its way through our political and cultural life, nurtured by the false notion that democracy means my ignorance is just as good as your knowledge. Okay? That's the kind of populist thing. My ignorance, just as good as your knowledge. The psychiatrist Ronald Lang is more charitable than Asimov, and instead of describing Americans as anti-intellectual and ignorant, he merely says there's a great deal they fail to notice. And because, quote, because we fail to notice that we fail to notice, there's little we can do to change, unquote. Giroux once more wrote, within the last 40 years, training has taken the place of critical education, and the call for job skills has largely replaced critical thinking. He links education and democracy and argues that without an informed public, there's no resistance in the name of democracy and justice. This all suggests that George Orwell is on point when his Pearls of Oceania were much like Trump's Republican base today. Quote from Orwell, the past was erased, the erasure was forgotten, the lie became the truth, unquote. I will just hold you for another 10 minutes or so, okay? Along with the muting of critical liberal education and the elevation of the business ethos that has taken over the university classrooms, there's a new label that describes the university experience as edutainment. A friend of mine, Michael Locke, who used to teach here on the campus, Michael came up with that idea, edutainment, regarding education as fun and entertainment. And I've heard students say, oh, I'm not doing that course, it's no fun. Well, I teach about racism and sexism and imperialism and colonial. If you want that to be fun, you got to be sick. You have to be prepared to take a critical look at yourselves and your histories to really claim to be educated. But if you're after training, then I think you were looking for that class next door. This feeds into the wider social trends that are marked by the cult of celebrity, the sports and entertainment culture, football games are important and the quarterback is. The ubiquitous social media that accompany widespread cultural dumbing down, civic illiteracy, reality TV, The Bachelor, gaming, TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, etc., where everything simply becomes interesting, awesome, and cool. Those are the three main terms that young people are using today. Such cultural pursuits have yielded what George Ritzer and Michael Ryan call nothing. They said this is all nothing. In their book, titled Nothing, they wrote, the basic argument is that globalization is bringing with it the worldwide spread of nothingness. We are witnessing the global proliferation of that which leads to be nothing, characterized by a lack of distinctive content, unquote. The shallowness of glitzy popular culture, gaming, influencers, fashionistas, the Oscars and Grammys, Disney World, the Super Bowl and the World Series, Taylor Swift, Justin Bieber and the Kardashians, etc., is labeled nothing. For much of what defines that popular culture today is vacuous, drained of meaning, and of dubious social value. Ours is a society then where education is dumbed down, where gaslighting is the norm, where credulousness is rife, and the stage is set for the embrace of post-truth and the sidelining of history, logic, evidence, and scientific fact. It breeds a context where cultural paranoia, ignorance, bigotry, and religious superstitions are commonplace and form the kind of fertile soil in which what is known takes a backseat to what is believed. The so-called big lie paves the way to a non-scientific post-truth reality. My quarrel is not so much with what liberal democracy is, but rather with what those who favor it as a superior system of government believe it is. For as I said earlier, a genuine electoral democracy will enshrine the right of recall, whereby the voters could legitimately remove an elected representative if she or he reneges on campaign promises. It is well for us as Canadians, Americans too, to ask ourselves whether democracy is A, what we have, B, what we think we have, or C, what we think we ought to have. How does a government made up of the country's most wealthy individuals and families successfully convince the mass of the working population that capitalist democratic government is for the little man and the little woman? How do you do that? When you see the absurd opulence in which so many live, the ease with which they can live and so on, they say, like Trump saying, I'm for the little man, I'm for the little woman, and people, yeah, he's one of us. 75 million votes in his second attempt at the presidency. Finally, Giroux noted, one of the most ludicrous interpretations of Trump's victory is that he represents the poor, the oppressed, the people left behind. He is the elite that he is supposed to fight. Deluded into thinking that a system of one person, one vote is synonymous with equality, today's democratized masses see their system of capitalist democracy as superior to all others. And they're less concerned that it was founded on undemocratic, racialized colonial invasions, the decimations of indigenous peoples, and the enslavement of millions of Africans, indigenous people, and others. While the system of democracy at home, one person, one vote, favored counting votes, institutionalized voter suppression, redistricting, and gerrymandering gave the lie to that claim. Even at home, one person, one vote does not mean that it is equal. But once in the colonies, once we leave home, we have something that I title Democracy Abroad. The colonizers were outnumbered, we were saying before, the Indians and so on. And they founded a system of democracy abroad that was secured not by one person, one vote, but by naked force. I'll kill you if you don't do as I say. But there were too many Indians to kill them all, so they co-opted them. Okay? And they played upon the pre-existing caste divisions and superimposed class divisions, and well, that's a whole different thing. As an example, consider the actions of Henry Kissinger, then National Security Advisor to President Nixon, who personally engineered the 1973 military coup that toppled the government of Chile and murdered Dr. Salvador Allende, the democratically elected president of the Chilean people. Murdered him. Kissinger was instrumental in installing and supporting Augusto Pinochet, the dictator, who ruled Chile for almost 2 decades with a bloody iron hand. And when the dust settled, a couple of months ago, Kissinger, who is still alive, turned 100 years, said, "I don't see why we need to stand idly by and watch a country go communist due to the irresponsibility of its people. The issues are much too important for the Chilean voters to be left to decide for themselves." The audacity. Que cojones? These issues, Chilean people, are too important for me to leave you to decide for yourself what is right. And nobody, when he turned 100, the ex-presidents of the United States, both parties, both branches of that party, they were hugging him and kissing and lauding, "Oh, you were such a great..." If you don't know your history, you will be condemned to relive it. I have 6 worrying facts about liberal democracy and the myths that underpin that system. First, how many innocent millions of people have been killed in places like Korea, Vietnam, Argentina, Chile, Iraq, and Afghanistan by democratically elected leaders such as Winston Churchill, Margaret Thatcher, George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, Tony Blair, Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama? What makes the fact that they were democratically elected so special? What? Second, the Constitution of the United States and of Canada, I think, does not require the boards of directors and shareholders of the leading economic institutions that are too big to fail to subject themselves to popular control by the voters or the citizens at large. It's the boards of directors and so on who vote on these things. So we do have a democracy, but you don't have a vote in what, and you know what's going on in the grocery stores these days, and how they're fleecing the people least able to put food on their tables and so on, because that's not up to a democratic vote. Okay? So the Constitution does not require that those big corporations subject themselves to public vote. Third, because those big institutions influence all aspects of the daily lives of citizens, and because governments are heavily dependent on them for taxes and job creation, they're able to dictate terms to government in ways that make them independent of government management and independent of the popular vote. This is why in that book, I think that you quoted Richer and Poorer, I said, in liberal democratic states, governments do not govern. Simple. In liberal democratic states, governments do not govern. Get rid of the fiction. Fourth, the economy is privately owned, and the private owners can do with it as they please as long as they remain within the law. But then they make the damn law. So they will always remain within the law. They make the laws. It's not the average Joe or Jane who makes the laws. Fifth, the very personnel who occupy key state positions, top civil servants, ambassadors, judges, police chiefs, army generals, etc., are not democratically chosen, yet they have a decisive impact on the daily lives of citizens. Sixth, final, successful politicians either have a great deal of personal wealth or corruptly can attract handsome campaign contributions from wealthy individuals and big corporations in whose interests they're expected to act once elected. This is why Richard Swift said, quote, "Money makes democracy dirty." Okay, let me just zip to the final paragraphs here. The obvious contradictions between the claim and the hundreds of thousands of homeless citizens the mentally ill who roam the streets, the increasing proliferation of soup kitchens and food banks to feed the hungry and destitute, do not shake the beliefs in the people's claims about freedom, for beliefs do not require scientific or empirical proof. It is a belief. As noted at the outset, there are three requirements about transparency, education, and so on. Ideological distractions aside, it is not clear whether capitalist democracy or liberal democracy qualifies as democracy under my definition. To conclude then, how does this all tie in with solidarity? The answer lies in education, not edutainment driven by helicopter parenting, nor vocational training, but the cultivation of critical thinking skills that promote the celebration of community, of sharing, of compassion, and the kind of confidence that is born of the rejection of ignorance. As students and teachers, this can only come from open-mindedness and the nurturing of imagination, and the simultaneous rejection of the divisiveness of materialism and consumerism, of individualism and liberalism, etc., that conspire to fragment us. A closed mind does not admit new information, and if you cannot be informed, you cannot be transformed, which is the goal of education, n'est-ce pas? Finally, education requires that we cultivate an imagination, for when we lack an imagination, we cannot begin to imagine what we lack. Still focused on solidarity. To end, I quote from Hillary Clinton. I don't really care for her and her politics, but she said things that resonated with me, and she said, "Though we are divided in so many ways, though we are lonelier and more isolated than ever, it remains true that none of us can raise a family, build a business, strengthen a community, or heal a nation alone. We have to do it together. It still takes a village." Thank you very much for your attention.